In this building at Cane Hill Road, some 40 men and women enrolled for the first full-time course in teacher training. This enrollment took place on the 11th of September 1950 at the Teachers Training College, which had been set up a few months earlier. Up to then, the TTC offered only part-time training. The founding of the TTC and the introduction of full-time courses marked a milestone in the evolution of education in Singapore. Two from this pioneer group of full-time teacher trainees went back to recount what it was like.
The course was very interesting. I think we were more or less like guinea pigs because we were the first batch.
And those were exciting times, because at that time things were beginning to move in Singapore. We were moving towards independence. Political parties were beginning to get into prominence, and we were part of that. It was very exciting at that time.
In the mid-19th century, when Singapore was under British colonial rule, there was no overall education plan. Children, if they were formally educated, studied in their own vernacular. The various religious and ethnic communities set up their own schools. Teachers for vernacular schools came from their respective countries of origin. There was, however, an increasing demand for English education, and teachers catering to this need either came from abroad or were graduates of Raffles College, which was set up in 1928. In 1942, the Japanese captured Singapore. During the occupation, those schools which still functioned had to teach Japanese language and ideology. After 3 years, the Japanese surrendered and the war ended. There was much rebuilding to be done. This included coping with the post-war baby boom. The burgeoning population and the education setback caused by the war created an urgent need to re-establish and expand education facilities. In 1946, the Singapore Advisory Council's 10-year education plan proposed to build schools in various parts of the island and establish a teacher training college. Initially, due to the acute shortage of teachers, the TTC trained English medium school teachers under an emergency scheme. It was 6 months later that the first ever full-time course was introduced.
I was part of the emergency training scheme. The part-time scheme meant primarily that one taught in a school and came back in the afternoons for lectures about 3 times a week. Whereas the full-time course, which started in September of 1950, meant that we remained in college for most of the time and only went out for teaching in blocks of 4 weeks.
With the full-time course, the trainees could concentrate on the comprehensive training program provided.
I suppose in content would measure up to what is being done today. But in other matters, the technological aids, OHPs, tape recorders and things like that were not available then. We had to rely mainly on our own voices and hands.
But they gave us quite a comprehensive course. We had English literature, theory and practice of education, and we had music, PE. I remember many things that we learned during that time.
You forget the once a week excursions we used to have. We had plays, projects to do, and we worked together all the time, and we helped each other. It was a wonderful class. We had ages ranging from 19 to 29, I think, and whereas some of us were quite young, others were very mature, and we were very cohesive because it was a small group.
Over the next 5 years, the number of trainees at the TTC more than trebled. The TTC also began to train teachers from other language streams. As the trainee intake increased, the TTC moved at the end of 1955 to its new premises at Patterson Road. At Patterson, the TTC progressively expanded its enrollment and diversified its programs. To alleviate the great shortage of teachers, the TTC scrapped its full-time course and introduced a new system of in-service training in 1960. This allowed student teachers to teach in schools and concurrently be trained at the TTC. Such a scheme was not ideal, but necessary at the time. Between 1963 and 1967, schools were built at an unprecedented rate of about 17 a year. The newly independent government placed education high on the agenda. It spent 1/3 of the national budget on education to meet the urgent educational needs of the nation. It was then up to the TTC to recruit enough teachers to cope with this dramatic expansion. The principal of the TTC during that time explains.
This was the time also when free primary education was introduced, and on the second day of January of any one year, there would be so many thousands of little kiddies, eager beavers waiting, raring to go, and there had to be so many hundreds of teacher bodies standing in front of them. This was really quite not merely an urgent situation, but I would say even a desperate situation, because we just didn't have the number of teachers to cope with these large numbers.
And the numbers were daunting. In 1967, more than a quarter of Singapore's total population were enrolled in primary and secondary schools. As Singapore's economy grew and diversified, people had to be trained to meet the country's manpower requirements. The TTC administration had to respond to these changes.
No longer were we just training a whole lot of children just to become clerks in offices and nothing else. We had to train young people to man the offices and to go into business houses and to go into areas where technical knowledge at higher than just artisan level was necessary. And this was really the reason why we had to go intensively into technical teacher training and diversify our program.
In 1970, Parliament passed the Institute of Education Act, which sets new aims for developing and diversifying teacher training. The Act envisioned teacher education to be more closely related to education research. Thus, when the Institute of Education was formed as an autonomous body, it comprised 3 components: the Teachers Training College, the School of Education of the University of Singapore, and the Research Unit of the Ministry of Education. The union of these components set new standards for teacher education.
So as a result, IE had this twin objectives or foresight, if you like. One is teacher training and the other is research in education. And what we have been trying to do is to relate teacher training and research more closely. So in so doing, the training now is somewhat different in the sense that we are trying to get teachers to be somewhat more research-oriented, to be more investigatory in the approach to teaching.
This is called micro-teaching.
At present, some 1,400 students are enrolled at the Institute. Trainees are carefully selected and receive full-time training. The Institute also has professional courses for teachers in service. Having overcome the shortage of teachers, the current emphasis on teacher training is a relentless drive for higher standards in education. And at the heart of this vision of excellence in education are soundly trained, well-motivated teachers.